Gefreiter Ernst Hoffmann stared at the farmhouse door, his calloused hands still trembling from hours of corn husking in the bitter Iowa wind. Behind him, 5 other German prisoners of war shifted nervously in their muddy boots, their faces reflecting the same disbelief that gripped his chest. Walter Jensen, the American farmer who had worked alongside them all morning, had just done something that defied every expectation of war. Something so unexpected that it would shatter everything Hoffmann thought he knew about his captors. The farmer had looked each prisoner in the eye and spoken words that would echo through history. Words that would transform enemies into something far more profound. But could a simple invitation really bridge the vast chasm between 2 nations locked in the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning had started like every other in the prisoner of war camp outside Cedar Falls, Iowa. November 23, 1944, dawned gray and cold, with the kind of bitter wind that cut through even the heaviest wool coats. Ernst Hoffmann pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around his lean frame as he stood with the other prisoners in the camp's main yard, waiting for the guards to assign their daily work details. At 26 years old, he had already spent 18 months in American captivity, ever since his capture at the Battle of Sicily, when his artillery unit was overrun by advancing Allied forces. The camp held nearly 800 German prisoners, most of them former Wehrmacht soldiers like himself, who had been transported across the Atlantic to work in America's agricultural heartland. The irony was not lost on Hoffmann that he, who had grown up on his family's small farm outside Munich, was now laboring on similar fields thousands of miles from home, under the watchful eyes of American guards, rather than his own father. Sergeant Bobby Martinez, the camp's work detail coordinator, approached their group with his usual morning clipboard and coffee cup. Martinez was a stocky man from Texas who had lost his left arm at Normandy and been reassigned to prisoner supervision. Unlike some of the other guards who maintained strict emotional distance, Martinez treated the Germans with professional courtesy, even occasional humor. "All right, boys," Martinez called out in his accented English, which most of the prisoners had learned to understand over the months. "Farmer Jensen needs 6 men for corn harvest. It's Thanksgiving preparation, so he's paying extra. Who's ready for some real American farm work?" Hoffmann stepped forward, along with 5 others. Klaus Weber, a former tank mechanic from Berlin. Hans Richter, a young infantry soldier barely 20 years old. Otto Zimmermann, a grizzled veteran of the Eastern Front. Friedrich Baumann, a baker's son from Hamburg. And Georg Kellnor, an artillery sergeant who had served in the same unit as Hoffmann in Italy. The truck ride to Jensen's farm took them through the rolling Iowa countryside, past harvested soybean fields and scattered farmhouses with thin columns of smoke rising from their chimneys. Hoffmann pressed his face to the window, watching the landscape roll by. It reminded him painfully of the Sema countryside around his hometown, with the same golden stubble of harvested grain and the same sense of quiet preparation for winter. Walter Jensen met them at his farm gate. A man of perhaps 50 with weathered hands and kind blue eyes that crinkled at the corners from years of squinting into prairie sun. He wore clean overalls and a thick flannel shirt, and when he spoke to Martinez, his voice carried the steady cadence of someone accustomed to hard work and honest dealing. "Morning, Sergeant," Jensen said, shaking Martinez's hand. "I appreciate you bringing these men out. My son's overseas with the Pacific Fleet, and my hired hands are all off to the war factories in Des Moines. Without help, I'd lose half this corn to the weather." Martinez nodded and gestured toward the prisoners. "They're good workers, Mr. Jensen. Hoffmann there used to farm in Germany, and Weber's handy with machinery. They'll treat you fair if you treat them fair." Jensen studied the 6 Germans with an expression that held neither hostility nor excessive friendliness, just the practical assessment of a farmer evaluating potential laborers. "Can any of you speak English?" he asked directly. Hoffmann stepped forward. His English was limited but functional, learned during long evenings in the camp from a fellow prisoner who had taught languages before the war. "I speak some, sir. We work hard for you." "Good," Jensen nodded. "It's simple work, husking corn and loading wagons. My wife's preparing a big Thanksgiving meal for tomorrow, and we need to get this harvest finished today, so we can take the holiday proper." The work began immediately. Jensen's cornfields stretched across gentle hills, the stalks brown and dry, ready for harvest. The Germans worked in pairs, moving methodically down the rows with the practiced efficiency of men who understood the rhythm of agricultural labor. The corn husks were brittle in the cold air, crackling as they peeled them away to reveal the golden kernels beneath. Hoffmann found himself working alongside Jensen for most of the morning, and he was surprised by the farmer's willingness to labor side by side with a prisoner of war. In the camps, the Germans were accustomed to guards maintaining strict separation, watching from a distance while the prisoners worked. But Jensen rolled up his sleeves and husked corn with the same steady rhythm as any of them. "You farm in Germany?" Jensen asked during one of their brief rest periods, his breath visible in small puffs in the cold air. "Yes, sir," Hoffmann replied, grateful for the chance to practice his English. "My family, we grow wheat and barley near Munich. My father, he still worked the land, I think." Jensen nodded thoughtfully. "Hard to leave the land during war. I worry about my own fields when I think about my boy overseas." He glanced toward the farmhouse, where smoke rose from the chimney. "My wife, she's been cooking since yesterday. Thanksgiving's important in our family." The mention of Thanksgiving stirred something uncomfortable in Hoffmann's chest. He had heard about the American holiday from other prisoners, but it remained foreign to him, another reminder of how far he was from home and the familiar traditions of his childhood. In Germany, his family would be preparing for Advent season. His mother would be baking stollen and hanging evergreen garlands in their small farmhouse kitchen. As the morning wore on, the temperature dropped and a light snow began to fall, dusting the harvested fields with white. The Sebel prisoners worked steadily, filling wagon after wagon with corn, while Jensen drove his tractor back and forth to the storage barn. Despite the cold, Hoffmann found the physical labor satisfying in a way that surprised him. There was something honest and clean about farm work that contrasted sharply with the grim uncertainty of camp life. Around noon, Jensen's wife appeared at the edge of the field. A woman of middle age, wearing a thick wool coat and carrying a large thermos. Margaret Jensen had graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the same kind eyes as her husband. She poured steaming coffee for everyone, including the prisoners, and distributed thick sandwiches made with fresh bread and roast beef. "You men are working hard," she said to Hoffmann in careful, slow English. "This coffee will warm you up." The coffee was better than anything they served in the camp, rich and hot, with real cream. Hoffmann wrapped his cold fingers around the metal cup and felt genuinely grateful for the warmth spreading through his chest. He noticed that Mrs. Jensen had packed enough sandwiches for everyone and had made no distinction between the American guards and the German prisoners in her simple act of hospitality. "Thank you, ma'am," he managed to say. "Very kind." She smiled at his careful English. "You're welcome. Hard work deserves good food." As they ate, Hoffmann observed the Jensen farm with new appreciation. It was clearly prosperous, but not wealthy. The kind of solid, middle-class operation that represented the backbone of American agriculture. The barn was well maintained, the equipment clean and properly stored, the livestock healthy and well-fed. It reminded him of his own family's farm, though the scale was larger and some of the machinery more modern. The afternoon passed quickly as they finished the corn harvest. By 4 o'clock, the last wagon was loaded and heading toward the barn, and Jensen surveyed his empty fields with visible satisfaction. The light snow had continued intermittently, creating a peaceful winter scene across the Iowa landscape. "Good work, all of you," Jensen said, addressing both the guards and the prisoners. "You've saved my harvest." Martinez was checking his watch and consulting the truck schedule when Jensen did something that no one expected. He looked directly at the 6 German prisoners, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "Tomorrow is Thanksgiving," he said slowly, making sure they understood his English. "It's a day when Americans give thanks for our blessings and share them with others." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "My wife and I would like to invite you men to join us for Thanksgiving dinner tomorrow, if the army allows it." The silence that followed was profound. Martinez stared at Jensen with undisguised surprise. while the 6 Germans looked at each other with expressions of complete bewilderment. Hoffmann felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. In 18 months of captivity, no American civilian had ever invited him into their home, let alone for a major holiday celebration. "Mr. Jensen," Martinez said carefully, "I appreciate the thought, but I'm not sure the regulations. I've already spoken with your commanding officer, Captain Williams." Jensen interrupted. "He said the decision was up to you and the men themselves. No one would be required to accept, of course." Hoffmann's mind raced as he tried to process this unexpected invitation. Part of him wanted to refuse immediately, to maintain the dignity of a German soldier who would not accept charity from his captors. But another part, the part that had been starving for human connection and genuine kindness, was deeply moved by Jensen's gesture. Klaus Weber was the first to speak, his English more limited than Hoffmann's. "Why you do this? We are enemies." Jensen considered the question seriously. "The war won't last forever. When it's over, we'll all have to find ways to live together again. Maybe sharing a meal is a place to start." Hans Richter, the youngest of the group, looked as if he might cry. Hoffmann could see the internal struggle on the young soldier's face, the same conflict between pride and hunger for human warmth that he felt himself. "I don't know if it's appropriate," Otto Zimmermann said in German to the others. "We are prisoners of war, not guests." "But we are also human beings," Georg Kellner replied, also in German. "When did we last sit at a family table?" Martinez looked at each of the Germans in turn. "It's your choice, men. I can arrange transport if you want to accept, or we can head back to camp for regular chow. No judgment either way." Hoffmann found himself at the center of attention as the others looked to him for guidance. As the most senior prisoner and the one with the best English, he had naturally become their spokesman. The weight of decision pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He thought of his own family's Thanksgiving traditions, though they called them by different names. The harvest festivals of his childhood, when neighboring farms would gather to celebrate the year's crops and share food and fellowship. The long tables in his grandfather's barn, laden with fresh bread and roasted meat, and his grandmother's famous apple strudel. The laughter and warmth that made even the hardest times bearable. "We accept," he said finally, the words coming out before he had fully decided to speak them. "We are grateful for your kindness." Jensen smiled for the first time that day, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. "Good. Dinner's at 2 o'clock. Sergeant Martinez can bring you by around 1:30. The drive back to camp was unusually quiet. Each of the Germans seemed lost in his own thoughts about what they had just committed to. Hoffmann stared out the truck window at the darkening Iowa countryside and wondered if he had made the right decision. Would accepting Jensen's hospitality compromise his integrity as a German soldier? Or was there something larger at stake, something about basic human decency that transcended the artificial boundaries of war? That evening in the camp, word of Jensen's invitation spread quickly through the barracks. Reactions were mixed. Some prisoners thought it was a trap or a propaganda scheme designed to soften their resistance. Others were openly envious, wishing they had been chosen for the work detail. A few, mostly older men who had families of their own back in Germany, understood immediately why Hoffmann and the others had accepted. "You did right," said Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Strauss, the senior German officer in the camp. "It takes courage to accept kindness from an enemy. Perhaps more courage than refusing it." Hoffmann lay awake most of that night, staring at the ceiling of his barracks and trying to imagine what the next day would bring. He had not shared a meal with a family since his capture, had not sat at a dining room table or participated in the comfortable rituals of civilian life. The prospect filled him with equal measures of anticipation and anxiety. Thanksgiving morning arrived clear and cold, with bright sunshine that made the previous day's light snow sparkle like diamonds across the campgrounds. Hoffmann and the other 5 men took extra care with their appearance, shaving carefully and brushing their uniforms as clean as possible. They were still prisoners of war, but they would be guests at an American family's table, and that seemed to demand a certain level of respect. Martinez picked them up at 1:15 in the same truck they had used for the work detail. The sergeant seemed as nervous as the prisoners, uncertain about the protocol for such an unusual situation. "Just be respectful," he advised as they drove toward the Jensen farm. "These are good people, and they're taking a risk by inviting you." The Jensen farmhouse looked different in the bright sunlight, more welcoming and substantial. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and they could see warm yellow light glowing in the windows. As they approached the front door, Hoffmann could smell the rich aromas of roasted turkey and baked bread. Scents that triggered powerful memories of holiday meals from his childhood. Walter Jensen met them at the door, dressed in his best shirt and tie, and welcomed them with the same straightforward friendliness he had shown in the bayou. "Fields. Come in, come in. Marbert's been cooking since dawn, and everything's about ready." The interior of the farmhouse was warm and comfortable, furnished with solid, well-made pieces that spoke of generations of careful stewardship. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, including several of a young man in Navy uniform who Hoffmann realized must be the Jensen's son stationed in the Pacific. The living room was dominated by a bowl, large dining table, covered with a white lace tablecloth, and set for 10 people. Margaret Jensen emerged from the kitchen, wearing her best dress and an apron, her face flushed from hours of cooking. She greeted each of the Germans by name, having apparently learned their names from her husband, and directed them to chairs around the dining table. "I hope you're hungry," she said with a warm smile. "I may have cooked enough for 20 people." The table was a masterpiece of American Thanksgiving tradition. In the center sat a golden brown turkey, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes, stuffing, cranberry sauce, green bean casserole, and fresh dinner rolls. There were also dishes that Hoffmann didn't recognize, regional specialties that represented the Jensen's Iowa heritage. As they took their seats, Hoffmann felt a profound sense of displacement, as if he had stepped into a dream or crossed some invisible threshold into an alternate reality. Here he was, a German prisoner of war, sitting at an American family's table on their most important holiday, about to share a meal that represented everything he had been taught to oppose. Walter Jensen took his place at the head of the table and gestured for everyone to join hands for the blessing. Hoffmann found himself holding Mrs. Jensen's soft hand on one side and Klaus Weber's calloused one on the other, connected in a circle that included both guards and prisoners, captors and captives. "Heavenly Father," Jensen began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of deep faith, "we thank you for the blessings of this harvest season, for the food on our table and the roof over our heads. We ask your protection for our son overseas, and for all the young men far from home, regardless of which uniform they wear. Help us to remember that we are all your children, created in your image, and worthy of love and dignity. Bless this food and those who share it, and guide us toward a day when all nations can live in peace. Amen." The Amen was echoed around the table in multiple languages and accents, but the sentiment was universal. Hoffmann felt tears prick his eyes as he realized that Jensen's prayer had included not just his own son fighting in the Pacific, but also the German soldiers sitting at his table. It was an act of moral imagination that staggered him with its simple profundity. Meal began with Margaret Jensen carving the turkey while her husband served the various side dishes. The conversation started tentatively, with Jensen asking the prisoners about their families and backgrounds. Hoffmann found himself talking about his parents' farm, about the wheat fields and apple orchards of his childhood, about the traditions that had shaped his life before the war. Hans Richter, gradually overcoming his shyness, described his mother's bakery in Hamburg and how she had taught him to make traditional German breads. Friedrich Baumann, who had worked in his family's carpentry shop, admired the craftsmanship of the Jensen's furniture and engaged Walter in a detailed discussion about woodworking techniques. As the afternoon progressed and the food and conversation flowed freely, something remarkable began to happen. The artificial barriers created by war and nationality started to dissolve, replaced by the fundamental human connections that transcend politics and conflict. They talked about farming and weather, about families and hopes for the future, about the simple, universal concerns that unite all people regardless of their circumstances. Margaret Jensen proved to be a masterful hostess, drawing out each of the prisoners and making them feel genuinely welcome at her table. She asked Otto Zimmermann about his wife and children, listened sympathetically to Georg Kellner's concerns about his elderly parents, and encouraged Klaus Weber to describe the mechanical innovations he had worked on before the war. The food itself was a revelation. After months of camp rations, the roasted turkey was incredibly flavorful, the mashed potatoes rich with real butter, the homemade bread still warm from the oven. But more than the quality of the meal was its symbolic significance. This was family food, prepared with love and served with genuine hospitality to people who had every reason to be considered enemies. "This stuffing is wonderful," Hoffmann said to Mrs. Jensen as he helped himself to a second serving. "What is the recipe?" "It's my grandmother's," she replied with obvious pride. "Sage and onions with cornbread and celery. She brought the recipe from Pennsylvania when she married my grandfather and settled here in Iowa." The mention of family traditions led to a broader conversation about heritage and the ways that food connects people to their cultural roots. The Germans shared descriptions of their own holiday foods. The Stollen and Lebkuchen of Christmas, the hearty soups and sausages that sustained them through long winters. The Americans were genuinely interested, asking questions and drawing parallels to their own traditions. As the main course gave way to dessert, pumpkin pie with fresh whipped cream and apple cider, Hoffmann realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of his captors. These were not the heartless conquerors portrayed in German propaganda, but ordinary people with their own fears and hopes, their own capacity for both kindness and cruelty. The war had made them enemies, but it had not made them fundamentally different from each other. The conversation eventually turned to more serious topics, though always with the careful respect that marked genuine dialogue. Walter Jensen talked about his concerns for his son in the Pacific, his worries about the young man's safety, and the psychological toll of combat. The German prisoners shared their own fears for families back home, their uncertainty about what they would find when they eventually returned to Germany. "War is hardest on the families," Jensen observed quietly. "They wait and worry and try to keep normal life going while their loved ones are far away facing dangers they can't even imagine." Hoffmann nodded, thinking of his own parents and the letters he was allowed to write once a month. "My mother, she write to me about the farm, about small things, the chickens and the garden. She does not write about the bombing or the shortages. She wants me to remember home as it was, not as it is." "That's love," Margaret Jensen said softly. "Sometimes love means protecting people from truths they can't bear." The afternoon stretched into early evening as the conversation continued over coffee and additional helpings of pie. Gradually, as the light outside began to fade, the reality of their situation reasserted itself. These men were still prisoners of war, and Martinez would need to transport them back to camp before the evening count. As they prepared to leave, Walter Jensen stood up and addressed the group with the same serious tone he had used for the blessing. "I want to thank you men for accepting our invitation and for sharing this day with us. I know it wasn't an easy decision, and I respect the courage it took to trust in the hospitality of strangers." He paused, looking at each of the Germans in turn. "The war will end someday, probably sooner than we think. When it does, you'll go home to your families and your own fields. I hope you'll remember that not all Americans were your enemies, just as I'll remember that not all Germans were mine." Hoffmann found himself deeply moved by the farmer's words. He stood up and, drawing on his limited English and the formal courtesy his parents had taught him, attempted to express his gratitude. "Mr. Jensen, Mrs. Jensen," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "We thank you for this day, for your kindness to men who are your enemies by circumstance, but not by choice. You have shown us the best of America, the generosity and humanity that war cannot destroy. We will not forget this." The leave-taking was awkward but heartfelt, with handshakes and brief embraces that transcended the formal boundaries of their relationship. As they climbed into Martinez's truck for the ride back to camp, each of the Germans carried with them not just the satisfaction of an excellent meal, but a profoundly altered understanding of their captors and perhaps of themselves. The ride back to camp was quiet. each man lost in his own reflections on the extraordinary day they had just experienced. Hoffmann stared out at the darkening Iowa landscape and tried to process what had happened to him. In the space of a few hours, his entire conception of America and Americans had been challenged and transformed. Back in the camp, their fellow prisoners greeted them with intense curiosity about their experience. Some were skeptical, wondering if the invitation had been some form of psychological manipulation designed to weaken their resolve. Others were openly envious, wishing they had been chosen for the work detail that led to such an unexpected adventure. But as Hoffmann described the day's events to his bunkmates, he realized that something more significant had occurred than simply sharing a good meal with kind people. He had been forced to confront the essential humanity of his enemies, to see them as individuals rather than, quote, abstractions. To acknowledge that the war that had brought him to America was only one layer of a much more complex human story. Over the following days and weeks, the memory of Thanksgiving dinner at the Jensen farm continued to occupy Hoffmann's thoughts. He found himself questioning assumptions about American culture and values that he had accepted without examination. The propaganda he had been, quote, taught about American decadence and moral weakness seemed hollow when measured against the genuine Christian charity he had experienced at that farmhouse table. The other prisoners who had shared the meal were similarly dull, affected. Hans Richter, the youngest of the group, began studying English more seriously, determined to improve his ability to communicate with Americans. Klaus Weber started a small workshop in the camp where he repaired machinery for local Bath farmers, finding satisfaction in the same kind of honest labor he had performed at the Jensen place. The impact extended beyond the 6 men who had attended the dinner. Their descriptions of the Sauwa experience sparked conversations throughout the camp about the nature of their captivity and the character of their captors. Some prisoners remained committed to their role as enemy soldiers, determined to maintain their resistance until the war ended. But others began to see their time in America as an opportunity to learn and grow, to understand a different way of life that might inform their own choices when they eventually returned home. For Hoffmann personally, the Thanksgiving dinner became a turning point in his captivity. He began to engage more actively with his American guards and civilian employers, trying to learn about their backgrounds and perspectives. He discovered that many of them had their own sons and brothers fighting in Europe, that they worried about the same things he worried about, that they were motivated by the same basic desires for family, security, and meaning. As winter deepened into the darkest months of the year, Hoffmann received a letter from his mother that brought devastating news. Their family farm had been badly damaged in an Allied bombing raid, their barn destroyed, and several of their livestock killed. His father had been injured in the attack and was recovering slowly. The letter was carefully censored, but between the lines, he could read the desperate struggle his family was enduring. The news might have reinforced his bitterness toward the Americans who held him captive, but instead, it deepened his appreciation for the Jensen family's gesture of reconciliation. They too had family at risk. They too lived with the constant fear that war brings to everyone it touches. Yet they had found the grace to reach across the divide of conflict and offer friendship to men who were nominally their enemies. Spring came early to Iowa in 1945, and with it, news of Germany's increasing desperation and the approaching end of the war in Europe. Hoffmann knew that his captivity would not last much longer. That soon, he would face the challenge of returning to a homeland that had been transformed by defeat and occupation. The prospect filled him with both longing and anxiety. In early May, just days after Germany's surrender, Hoffmann received an unexpected visitor at the camp. Walter Jensen had come to see him, bringing news that his son had survived the Pacific campaign and would be coming home soon. But more than that, he had come to say goodbye and to offer something that Hoffmann had not dared to hope for. "I've spoken with the authorities about your repatriation," Jensen said during their brief meeting in the camp's visitor area. "When you're ready to go home, Margaret and I want you to know that you'll always have friends in Iowa. If things are difficult in Germany, if you need help getting back on your feet, you write to us." Hoffmann was too overwhelmed to respond immediately. The offer of ongoing friendship and support from the man whose table he had shared was almost beyond his ability to comprehend. It represented a level of forgiveness and human generosity that challenged everything he thought he understood about the nature of conflict and reconciliation. "Mr. Jensen," he finally managed to say, "you have already given me more than I can ever repay. That day at your table, you showed me that enemies can become friends, that war does not have to destroy everything good in the world. I will carry that lesson with me always." They shook hands for what they both knew might be the last time, but the connection forged over turkey and pumpkin pie would endure long after they parted. Hoffmann would indeed return to Germany, where he would help rebuild his family's farm and eventually become a leader in the post-war reconciliation efforts between Germany and America. The seeds of that reconciliation had been planted at a farmhouse table in Iowa, nurtured by the simple act of sharing a meal with strangers who chose to see enemies as potential friends. Years later, when Hoffmann had grandchildren of his own, he would tell them about the Thanksgiving when he learned that the strength of America lay not in its weapons or its wealth, but in its capacity to extend hospitality even to those it had every reason to hate. It was a lesson that shaped his understanding of what it meant to be human in a world too often divided by hatred and fear. The story of that extraordinary Thanksgiving dinner became part of the larger narrative of how former enemies learned to become allies, how individual acts of courage and compassion could bridge the deepest divisions. In a small farmhouse in rural Iowa, around a table laden with the traditional foods of American gratitude, 6 German prisoners of war had discovered that the most powerful force in human affairs is not the machinery of war, but the simple recognition of our shared humanity. Margaret Jensen would later write in her diary that hosting those German prisoners had been one of the most important things she and Walter had ever done. Not because it changed the course of the war or influenced great events, but because it affirmed their belief that every person, regardless of circumstances, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. It was a small gesture in the context of global conflict, but it carried within it the seeds of the peace that would eventually heal the wounds of war. The last time Hoffmann saw American soil was from the deck of a transport ship, taking him and hundreds of other repatriated prisoners back across the Atlantic toward an uncertain future in defeated Germany. As the Iowa coastline faded behind him, he carried with him the memory of that November afternoon when enemies had become guests, when the barriers of war had been temporarily dissolved by the simple human ritual of an ean, sharing a meal. He would keep his promise to Walter Jensen, writing regularly over the years that followed, sharing news of his family's recovery and Germany's gradual reconstruction. The correspondence became a bridge between two families, two nations, two former enemies who had learned that the things that unite human beings are far more powerful than the things that divide them. The journey home to Germany in late summer of 1945 was unlike anything Hoffmann could have imagined when he first crossed the Atlantic as a prisoner 2 years earlier. The transport ship carried nearly 2,000 German POWs from camps across the American Midwest, men who had spent months or years working in factories, on farms, and in lumber camps from Minnesota to Konya, Louisiana. They were returning to a homeland that had been utterly transformed by defeat, occupation, and the massive destruction of the final months of war. During the long Atlantic crossing, Hoffmann found himself in the unusual position of being sought out by other prisoners who had heard about his Thanksgiving experience with the Jensen family. Word of the dinner had spread through the informal network that connected POW camps across America, becoming something of a legend among German prisoners who had experienced very different relationships with their American captors. "Tell me again about the prayer," asked Lieutenant Wilhelm Brenner, a Luftwaffe pilot who had been shot down over Italy and spent 3 years in a camp in Texas. Did the American farmer really pray for German soldiers? Hoffmann had told this story dozens of times during the voyage, but he never tired of sharing it. Each retelling seemed to reinforce the significance of what had happened that November afternoon in Iowa, not just for the 6 men who had been present, but for what it represented about the possibility of reconciliation between former enemies. He prayed for his son in the Pacific, and then he prayed for all young men far from home, regardless of which uniform they wore, Hoffmann repeated. He included us in his prayer, treated us as fellow human beings worthy of God's protection. I had never experienced anything like it. Brenner shook his head in amazement. In Texas, the guards were professional but distant. We worked, we ate our rations, we slept in our barracks. No American civilian ever invited us into their home. I'm not sure I would have known how to respond. Other prisoners gathered around as Hoffmann described not just the dinner itself, but the broader impact it had on his understanding of America and Americans. He talked about how the experience had challenged his preconceptions, how it had forced him to see his captors as individuals rather than enemies, how it had planted seeds of respect that would influence his perspective for the rest of his life. The hardest part, Hoffmann admitted, was accepting that people we had been taught to hate could show us such kindness. It meant confronting the possibility that much of what we had believed about America was wrong, that the propaganda had obscured important truths about their character. Among the prisoners listening was Hauptmann Rudolf Steinberg, a former Wehrmacht officer who had been captured at the Battle of the Bulge and spent 8 months in a camp in Nebraska. Steinberg had maintained a rigid adherence to military protocol throughout his captivity, refusing to engage with Americans beyond the minimum required by the Geneva Convention. "I understand your gratitude," Steinberg said carefully, "but we must remember that individual kindness does not erase the larger conflict. America is still the nation that bombed our cities and killed our pride. Comrades." Hoffmann nodded, acknowledging the complexity of Steinberg's position. "You're right that individual acts don't change the facts of war, but they do reveal something about human nature that war tends to obscure. The Jensen family didn't invite us to dinner because they supported Germany or opposed their own country. They did it because they saw us as human beings who deserved basic dignity and respect." End quote. The debate that followed reflected the broader struggle that many German prisoners faced as they prepared to return home. How should they understand their captivity experience? How should they reconcile the kindness some had received from individual Americans with the devastating impact of American military power on Germany? How should they process the reality that they had often been treated better as prisoners in America than many German civilians had been treated in their own homeland during the war's final desperate months? These questions became even more complex as the ship approached European waters and the prisoners received their first detailed accounts of what had happened to Germany during their absence. The stories that reached them through Red Cross communications and fellow passengers were almost impossible to comprehend. Major cities reduced to rubble, millions of civilians displaced, the country divided into occupation zones controlled by the victorious Allies. Klaus Weber, who had shared the Thanksgiving dinner and worked alongside Hoffmann throughout their captivity, stood at the ship's railing one evening as they sailed through the English Channel. The lights of Dover were visible in the distance, the first European land they had seen in years. "I keep thinking about Mrs. Jensen's kitchen," Weber said quietly. "The warmth of it, the smell of fresh bread, the way she made sure everyone had enough to eat. When I try to imagine what we're going back to, I can't picture anything like that. Everything I remember about home seems like it happened a century ago." Hoffmann understood exactly what his friend meant. The Iowa farmhouse had represented a kind of domestic normalcy that now seemed impossibly distant from the reality they were about to face. The simple pleasure of sitting around a family table, of being welcomed as a guest rather than supervised as a prisoner, of participating in traditions that celebrated abundance and gratitude rather than survival and scarcity. All of this belonged to a world that might no longer exist. When they finally docked at Bremerhaven in early September, the physical destruction was immediately apparent. The port city had been heavily bombed during the war, and entire neighborhoods were nothing but rubble and twisted metal. The German officials who processed the returning prisoners were efficient but grim, men who had clearly seen too much suffering to waste energy on ceremony or celebration. The journey from Bremerhaven to Bavaria took Hoffmann through landscapes that were both familiar and shocking. Towns he remembered as prosperous and neat were scarred by bombing and artillery damage. Refugees crowded the roads, carrying their possessions in carts and suitcases, searching for relatives or simply for places where they might be able to survive the coming winter. When he finally reached his family's farm outside Munich, Hoffmann found a scene that was both better and worse than he had feared. The farmhouse itself was still standing, though with significant damage from the bombing raid his mother had described in her letter. His parents were alive and had managed to keep the farm marginally operational, but they had aged dramatically during his absence, worn down by years of privation and uncertainty. The reunion with his family was overwhelming in ways that Hoffmann had not anticipated. His mother wept when she saw him, clinging to him as if she feared he might disappear again. His father, always a man of few words, simply gripped his hand and nodded, but Hoffmann could see tears in the older man's eyes. "We never stopped believing you would come home," his mother said over and over as she prepared the best meal she could manage with their limited resources. "Even when the news was worst, when we didn't hear from you for months, I knew you would return to us." The food was sparse compared to what Hoffmann remembered from before the war, and certainly nothing like the abundance he had experienced at the Jensen table. But it was prepared with love, and served in the familiar kitchen of his childhood, and that made it precious beyond description. Over the following days, as Hoffmann settled back into the rhythm of farm life, he began to understand the full scope of what Germany had endured during his captivity. The bombing campaigns had been far more extensive than he had realized from his limited information in the prison camp. Food rationing had continued throughout the war and remained severe even after Germany's surrender. Most devastating of all, millions of German soldiers remained missing or dead, leaving families throughout the country uncertain about the fate of their loved ones. His parents were eager to hear about his experiences in America, though they approached the subject with some trepidation. Like many Germans, they had been conditioned to expect the worst from Allied captivity, and they were genuinely surprised by his accounts of fair treatment and occasional kindness. "They really let you work on farms?" his father asked when Hoffmann described his agricultural labor in Iowa. "You weren't forced into factories or mines?" "Some prisoners worked in factories," Hoffmann explained. "But many of us were assigned to farms, especially those of us with agricultural experience. The work was hard, but it was honest work, and the farmers generally treated us fairly." When he told them about the Thanksgiving dinner, his parents listened with fascination and disbelief. His mother was particularly moved by his description of Walter Jensen's hospitality and the care she had taken to make the German prisoners feel welcome in her home. "It sounds like something from before the war," his mother said wistfully. "When neighbors were neighbors, regardless of politics or nationality. I had begun to think such kindness was lost forever." The contrast between his American captivity and the harsh realities of post-war Germany became more apparent as autumn progressed. Food remained scarce, fuel for heating was almost impossible to obtain, and the economic system had virtually collapsed. Most challenging of all was the psychological adjustment to a country that had been not just defeated, but thoroughly discredited, its national mythology shattered by the revelations of what the Nazi regime had done in the Führer. Name of the German people. Hoffmann found himself in the position of defending aspects of American character to fellow Germans who remained bitter about their defeat. His accounts of fair treatment and occasional kindness were sometimes met with skepticism or even hostility from people who preferred to maintain their anger rather than confront the complexity of their situation. "You were lucky to be captured by Americans," said his neighbor Franz Müller, whose son had been killed at Stalingrad. "They could afford to be generous because they were winning. If the situation had been reversed, do you think German guards would have invited American prisoners for Christmas dinner?" The question haunted Hoffmann because he wasn't sure he could answer it with confidence. Would Germans have shown the same capacity for individual kindness toward enemy prisoners? The evidence from the war suggested that such gestures would have been rare at best. Yet the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was precisely what made the Jensen family's invitation so significant. It represented a choice to transcend the hatred and fear that war inevitably generates, a decision to affirm human dignity even in the midst of conflict. As winter approached, Hoffmann received his first letter from Walter Jensen since returning to Germany. The Iowa farmer's careful handwriting brought news of the harvest season, of his son's safe return from the Pacific, and of the family's continued prayers for Hoffmann and his fellow former prisoners as they rebuilt their lives in Beraa. Post-war Germany. "We think of you often," Jensen wrote, "especially during our family meals when we remember that afternoon we shared together. Margaret asks me to tell you that you will always have a place at our table if you ever find yourself in Iowa again. We know the toll. Situation in Germany is difficult. And we want you to know that our offer of friendship was not just for wartime, but for whatever challenges the future may bring." End quote. The letter also included a package with coffee, sugar, and other items that were luxury goods in post-war Germany. But more valuable than the contents was the message the package conveyed: that the connection forged over Thanksgiving dinner had survived the end of the war and the return to normal life. It was a reminder that the human bonds created during those few hours in Iowa were stronger than the political and military forces that had brought them together. Hoffmann showed the letter to his parents, who were moved by the Jensen family's continued concern for their son's welfare. His mother immediately began composing a reply, thanking the American family for their kindness and expressing her own gratitude for the way they had treated her son during his captivity. "I wish there was something we could send them in return," she said, looking around their damaged farmhouse with its empty pantry and depleted resources. "They have been so generous, and we have so little to offer." "The most important thing we can offer is our friendship," Hoffmann replied. "Mr. Jensen told me once that the war wouldn't last forever, but the relationships we build with each other can endure long after the fighting ends." I think he was right. The correspondence with the Jensen family became a bright spot in the difficult months of post-war reconstruction. Hoffmann's letters to Iowa described his family's gradual recovery, the slow process of rebuilding their damaged farm, and the complex challenges of adjusting to life in occupied Germany. Walter Jensen's replies offered encouragement and practical advice based on his own experiences with agricultural challenges, as well as updates on American farming innovations that might be useful in German reconstruction. More importantly, the letters created a bridge between two worlds that were struggling to understand each other in the aftermath of global conflict. Through Hoffmann's eyes, the Jensen family gained insights into the reality of life in defeated Germany, while Hoffmann continued to learn about American values and perspectives through their ongoing friendship. In the spring of 1946, Hoffmann made a decision that would have been unthinkable before his captivity experience. He began studying English seriously, using materials provided by the American occupation authorities, and practicing with other Germans who had developed language skills during their time as prisoners of war. His goal was not just to communicate more effectively with the Jensen family, but to prepare himself for what he sensed would be a dramatically different future for Germany and Europe. The English lessons led to opportunities to serve as a translator for American officials working on reconstruction projects in the Munich area. This work brought Hoffmann into regular contact with Americans who were grappling with the complex challenges of rebuilding a stable, democratic Germany from the ruins of the Nazi state. Major Robert Harrison, the American officer who supervised several agricultural reconstruction projects, was initially surprised to learn about Hoffmann's background as a former prisoner of war who had maintained friendly contact with an Iowa farming family. "That's unusual," Harrison admitted during one of their first meetings. Most former prisoners seem eager to forget about their captivity experience and focus on getting their lives back to normal. Hoffmann considered how to explain the lasting impact of his Thanksgiving experience. "For me, the captivity was not just something to forget. It taught me important lessons about America and Americans that I think are valuable as our countries try to rebuild their relationship." Harrison was intrigued enough to ask for details, and Hoffmann found himself once again telling the story of Walter Jensen's unexpected invitation and the dinner that had changed his understanding of his captors. The American officer listened with growing amazement, particularly to Hoffmann's account of the farmer's prayer that had included German soldiers along with American ones. "That's the kind of story that gives me hope for what we're trying to accomplish here," Harrison said when Hoffmann finished. "If individual Americans and Germans can find ways to see each other as human beings rather than enemies, maybe our governments can eventually do the same." The conversation led to Harrison asking Hoffmann to participate in some of the cultural exchange programs that the American occupation authorities were developing to promote understanding between former enemies. These programs brought together Germans and Americans to discuss everything from agricultural techniques to democratic governance, creating forums for the kind of honest dialogue that had been impossible during the war. Hoffmann's first presentation to one of these groups was about his POW experience, focusing particularly on the Thanksgiving dinner and its impact on his understanding of American values. The audience included both Germans and Americans, and the discussion that followed revealed the complex emotions and preconceptions that both sides brought to their post-war relationship. "How do we know that your experience was typical?" asked Dr. Elizabeth Weber, a German academic who had lost her husband in the bombing of Dresden. Perhaps this Iowa farmer was exceptional, and most American treatment of German prisoners was much harsher. Hoffmann acknowledged that his experience might not have been universal, but he argued that this made it even more significant. Even if such kindness was rare, the fact that it occurred at all tells us something important about the capacity for human decency that exists even in wartime. It suggests that the foundations exist for building a better relationship between our peoples. POW. The Americans in the group were equally interested in understanding what the dinner had meant to Hoffmann and how it had influenced his perspective on America. Captain Sarah Mitchell, a nurse who had worked in military hospitals throughout the war, was particularly moved by Hoffmann's description of Walter Jensen's maternal care for the German prisoners. "It sounds like she saw you as someone's son rather than as an enemy," Mitchell observed. "That kind of perspective can be transformative, both for the person who extends it and for the person who receives it." These discussions reinforced Hoffmann's growing conviction that his Thanksgiving experience had broader significance than just a personal memory of kindness. It represented a model for how former enemies might learn to see each other differently, how individual acts of courage and compassion could create the foundation for larger reconciliation. By the summer of 1946, Hoffmann had become something of an advocate for German-American understanding, speaking to groups throughout the Munich area about his captivity experience and the lessons it held for post-war reconstruction. His work came to the attention of American officials in Washington who were developing policies for long-term German rehabilitation and integration into the Western Alliance. The invitation to visit the United States as part of a cultural exchange program came as a complete surprise. The State Department was sponsoring a small group of German civilians to tour American farms and discuss agricultural cooperation as part of the Marshall Plan development. Hoffmann's unique background as a former prisoner who had maintained friendly relations with an American farming family made him an ideal candidate for the program. The prospect of returning to America, this time as a guest rather than a prisoner, filled Hoffmann with complex emotions. He was eager to see Walter and Margaret Jensen again, to thank them properly for their kindness and to show them how profoundly their gesture had influenced his life. But he was also nervous about how he would be received by Americans who might see him as a representative of the enemy they had fought so hard to defeat. His parents were both proud and worried about his opportunity to return to America. They had come to understand through his letters and stories how much the Jensen family meant to him. But they also feared that he might be disappointed by the reality of visiting America as a civilian rather than remembering it through the lens of his unique captivity experience. "Promise me you'll be careful," his mother said as she helped him prepare for the journey. "I know these people were kind to you during the war, but times have changed, and feelings may be different now." Hoffmann assured her that he understood the risks, but privately he felt confident that the Jensens would welcome him as warmly as they had that November afternoon in 1944. The correspondence they had maintained over the past 2 years had convinced him that their friendship was genuine and enduring, not just a wartime anomaly. The flight from Frankfurt to New York in September 1947 was Hoffmann's first time in an airplane, and the experience of seeing Europe and then America from the air gave him a new perspective on the geography of his captivity experience. The Atlantic that had taken weeks to cross by ship now passed beneath him in hours, making the distance between his two worlds seem less insurmountable. New York was overwhelming in its energy and diversity, unlike anything Hoffmann had experienced during his time in rural Iowa prison camps. The skyscrapers and crowds and constant motion of the city represented a side of America that he had only imagined during his captivity. But it was the train journey west through Pennsylvania and Ohio and Illinois that really captured his attention. As he watched the American countryside roll by and remembered his first impressions of this land from the windows of prisoner transport vehicles 3 years earlier, When the train finally reached Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Hoffmann felt his heart racing with anticipation and anxiety. Walter Jensen had written that he would meet the train personally, but Hoffmann worried that the passage of time and the change in circumstances might make their reunion awkward or disappointing. He needn't have worried. Walter Jensen was waiting on the platform when the train pulled into the station, and his face broke into the same warm smile that Hoffmann remembered from their first meeting. The farmer looked a bit older and grayer, but his handshake was as firm and his eyes as kind as they had been during the war. "Welcome back to Iowa, Ernst," Jensen said, using Hoffmann's first name for the first time. "Margaret's been cooking for 3 days, and she's determined to show you that Iowa hospitality didn't end with the war." The drive to the Jensen farm took them through countryside that was both exactly as Hoffmann remembered and somehow more beautiful than his memories had suggested. The September corn was reaching maturity, turning golden in fields that stretched to the horizon, and the farmhouses they passed looked prosperous and peaceful in the late afternoon sunlight. The Jensen farmhouse itself was unchanged, still the solid, comfortable home where Hoffmann had experienced his moment of transformation 3 years earlier. But Margaret Jensen had aged more noticeably than her husband, and Hoffmann could see in her face the strain of worrying about her son throughout his Pacific service and the relief of his safe return. "Look at you," she said, embracing Hoffmann with the warmth of a mother greeting a returning son. "You look healthy and strong. I'm so glad things have worked out well for you back home." The dinner that evening was deliberately reminiscent of their Thanksgiving meal, with many of the same dishes and the same sense of celebration and gratitude. But the conversation was different, reflecting the changed relationship between former enemies who had become genuine friends. They talked about the challenges of post-war reconstruction, about the Jensen son's adjustment to civilian life after Burr, his Navy service, about Hoffmann's work with the American occupation authorities, and his hopes for Germany's democratic future. "I keep thinking about that prayer you said over our Thanksgiving dinner," Hoffmann told Walter Jensen as they sat on the front porch after the meal. "About how we're all God's children, regardless of which uniform we see wear." It's taken me 3 years to fully understand how profound that statement was. Jensen nodded thoughtfully. "Margaret and I have talked about that day many times. We weren't sure at the time whether inviting you men was the right thing to do. Some of our neighbors thought we were being naive or even unpatriotic. But seeing how it affected you and the others convinced us that we had made the right choice." The visit stretched into a week, as Hoffmann participated in the cultural exchange program, touring Iowa farms and discussing agricultural techniques with American farmers. But the most meaningful part of his time in Iowa was simply being welcomed back into the Jensen family circle, participating in their daily routines, and witnessing firsthand the values and traditions that had made their wartime hospitality possible. On his last evening at the farm, Margaret Jensen presented him with a gift that moved him to tears. A hand-knitted sweater that she had made in the colors of both the American and German flags, intertwined in a pattern that symbolized the friendship that had developed between their families. "I want you to remember," she said as she gave him the sweater, "that enemies can become friends, and that friendship can survive even the worst conflicts. What we've shared proves that people of goodwill can always find ways to understand each other." The return journey to Germany was bittersweet, filled with gratitude for the experience, but sadness at leaving friends who had become like family. Hoffmann carried with him not just Margaret's sweater and a suitcase full of gifts for his parents, but a renewed conviction that the work of reconciliation between former enemies was both possible and essential. Back in Germany, Hoffmann threw himself into the reconstruction effort with new energy and purpose. His American experience had given him credibility with both German civilians and American officials, and he became increasingly involved in programs designed to promote understanding between the former enemies. He spoke regularly about his experiences, helped translate important documents, and served as a cultural interpreter for Americans working in Germany and Germans preparing to visit the United States. In 1949, when the Federal Republic of Germany was established, Hoffmann was among the Germans invited to participate in the ceremonies marking the birth of the new democratic nation. Standing in the audience as Konrad Adenauer took the oath as West Germany's first chancellor, Hoffmann thought about the long journey from that November afternoon in Iowa to this moment of national rebirth. The values he had witnessed at the Jensen family table, the belief in human dignity and the possibility of redemption, had become central to the new Germany's constitution and governing philosophy. The connection was not direct or simple, but Hoffmann believed that the thousands of individual acts of kindness and understanding that had occurred between Americans and Germans during and after the war had created the foundation for the larger reconciliation that was now taking place. His correspondence with the Jensen family continued throughout the 1950s and 60s, chronicling his marriage to a local teacher named Anna Mueller, the birth of their children, and his eventual establishment of a successful farm equipment business that employed dozens of people in the Munich area. Walter and Margaret Jensen shared news of their son's marriage, the birth of grandchildren, and the continued prosperity of their Iowa farm. More importantly, the letters documented the gradual transformation of Germany from a defeated enemy into a trusted ally of the United States. Each milestone in this process, from Germany's entry into NATO to the construction of the Berlin Wall to the eventual reunification of East and West Germany, was discussed and celebrated in the correspondence between Iowa and Bavaria. In 1974, 30 years after their first Thanksgiving dinner together, Hoffmann returned to Iowa for a special celebration. Walter Jensen was retiring from active farming, and the family had decided to hold a reunion dinner that would bring together as many as possible of the people who had been touched by their original act of wartime hospitality. Klaus Weber came from Berlin, where he had become a successful engineer. Hans Richter traveled from Hamburg, where he ran a bakery that had become famous throughout northern Germany. Even Otto Zimmermann, now in his 70s and using a walking stick, made the journey from Austria, where he had settled after the war. The reunion dinner was held in the same farmhouse dining room where the original Thanksgiving had taken place. Around the same table where 6 German prisoners of war had discovered that their enemies could also be their friends. The conversation that evening ranged across 3 decades of history, from the end of World War II through the Cold War to the current détente between East and West. But what struck Hoffmann most powerfully was the presence of the next generation. Walter and Margaret Jensen's grandchildren, his own children, the sons and daughters of Klaus and Hans and the others. These young people, born in freedom and growing up in a world where German-American friendship was taken for granted, represented the ultimate fruit of that long-ago decision to invite enemies to dinner. "I want you children to understand," Walter Jensen said during the blessing that opened the meal, "that the friendship you see among the adults at this table was not something that happened naturally or easily. It required courage and faith and a willingness to see past the hatred and fear that war creates. The fact that you can grow up taking this friendship for granted is perhaps the greatest gift we can leave you." As the evening progressed and the stories flowed around the table, Hoffmann realized that the Thanksgiving dinner of 1944 had become more than just a personal memory or even a symbol of reconciliation between former enemies. It had become a living tradition, a reminder that individual acts of courage and compassion can have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances. The last time Hoffmann saw Walter Jensen was in 1982. When the Iowa farmer was in his 80s and clearly failing, Hoffmann made a special trip to America when he learned that his old friend was seriously ill. Wanting to thank him once more for the gift of dignity and humanity he had received at that farmhouse table so many years before. "You changed my life that day," Hoffmann told Jensen as they sat together on the front porch of the farmhouse. "Not just because you fed me when I was hungry, but because you showed me that enemies don't have to remain enemies forever. You taught me that there's always hope for understanding and reconciliation, even in the darkest times." Jensen, weakened by illness but still clear in his thinking, gripped Hoffmann's hand with surprising strength. "You gave us a gift too, Ernst. You and your friends showed Margaret and me that our faith in human goodness wasn't naive or foolish. You proved that people of different nations and backgrounds can find common ground if they're willing to look for it." Walter Jensen died peacefully that winter, and Hoffmann traveled to Iowa again for the funeral. standing in the small country church where he had never been, but which had shaped the values of the family that had transformed his life. Hoffmann felt the weight of history and the power of individual choice that can change the course of human events. In his eulogy, Hoffmann spoke about the farmer who had dared to invite his enemies to dinner, who had seen past the uniforms and nationalities to the human beings beneath. He talked about the courage it had taken to extend that invitation and the wisdom it had represented about the true nature of strength and victory. Walter Jensen understood something that many people never learn, Hoffmann said to the congregation of neighbors and friends who had gathered to honor the farmer's memory. He understood that the greatest victories are not won on battlefields but around dinner tables. Not through the defeat of enemies, but through their transformation into friends. His legacy lives on in all of us, who were touched by his example of grace and hospitality." End quote. The tradition continued with the next generation. Margaret Jensen lived until 1994, and throughout her final years, she made sure that the story of that wartime Thanksgiving dinner was preserved and passed down to her children and grandchildren. She established a small scholarship fund to bring young Germans to Iowa and young Iowans to Germany, continuing the work of building understanding between peoples who had once been enemies. Hoffmann himself lived until 2003, long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall, Germany reunified, and the European Union established as a force for peace and cooperation among nations that had once torn each other apart in the bloodiest wars in human history. Throughout his later years, he continued to speak about his wartime experience and its lessons for contemporary conflicts around the world. The invitation to that Thanksgiving dinner was more than an act of individual kindness, he would tell audiences of students and civic groups. It was a choice to affirm human dignity over national hatred, to believe in the possibility of redemption and reconciliation, even in the midst of the world's darkest hour. That choice changed my life, but more importantly, it demonstrated principles that can change the world. The farmhouse where it all began still stands in rural Iowa, now owned by Walter Jensen's grandson, but maintained as a reminder of what happened there on that November afternoon in 1944. A small plaque by the front door tells the story of the German prisoners of war who were invited to share Thanksgiving dinner with their captors, an act of courage and compassion that helped plant the seeds of lasting peace between Galda, former enemies. Every year on Thanksgiving Day, members of the Jensen family and descendants of the German prisoners gather around that same dining room table to remember the meal that proved enemies can become friends and strangers can become family. The tradition continues, a living testament to the power of individual choice to transcend the hatred and fear that too often divide the human family. The story of Ernst Hoffmann and Walter Jensen reminds us that even in the darkest times, there are always people willing to choose hope over fear, compassion over hatred, understanding over prejudice. Their legacy lives on in every act of hospitality extended to strangers, every bridge built between former enemies, every moment when someone chooses to see the humanity in those they have been taught to hate. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of all, that the fate of nations and the course of history are shaped not just by the decisions of governments and generals, but by the individual choices of ordinary people who dare to believe that a better world is possible and are willing to take the first small steps toward making it real.